So thanks very much, and Robert, take it away.
Thank you, Deborah, very much for that. And thank you again, ladies and gentlemen, for turning up on such a nice evening, Friday evening. I'm sure there's millions of other things that you could be usefully doing, so it's lovely to see you. My name's Robert Howard, and I'm based at the Nottingham Tree Ring Dating Laboratory, which is based in Sherwood in Nottingham. Now, it's not quite Sherwood Forest in Nottingham, it's a district of Nottingham, and we just thought Sherwood was a good place for a tree ring dating laboratory to exist. There's myself and a colleague, and we work with other people such as building historians, documentary researchers, and surveyors, etc., on a complete range of buildings. But what I'm going to talk about this evening is the sort of theoretical approach, the science behind tree ring dating or dendrochronology, the practicalities of it and how it works and how it's done, and then I'm going to show what we did here. So it's tree ring dating and how it's done and how it was done here. Now, before I really get going, could I ask if anybody suddenly can't hear me, if I start mumbling or anything, please don't hesitate to say can't hear you or what have you, just say speak up or whatever. Thank you. And if you have any questions as I'm talking, please feel free to ask them as I go along, or if you have any observations, or if you want to make a point, or if you want me to clarify a point, please don't hesitate. I'm perfectly happy to sort of have sort of discussions as we go along, and there will be time at the end for further questions. So the laboratory, the tree ring dating laboratory, based in Nottingham, specialises in dating timbers, mostly sort of timbers in historic buildings, churches, stately homes, etc. But you will see some other examples. Now, the raw material for our work is, of course, trees, particularly oak trees, and particularly oak timbers. The timbers that we see here, of the main structural timbers of the hammer beams and the posts, etc., and the timbers in the roof itself are all oak. They've all been derived from oak trees. And the theory behind tree ring dating is remarkably simple. When trees grow, as you all know, they produce annual growth rings. And if I start passing lumps of wood about the place, and you look, I'm sure you've seen anyway, but feel free to pass this on. When trees grow, they produce an annual growth ring. One ring each year, and only one ring each year. And these trees growing in this clump of, this copse of woodland here, they're all being affected by the same weather in the same way. The soils are going to be very similar, the sort of aspect of the ground is very similar, and the topography is very similar. So the trees are going to grow in very much the same way. Now, as the trees grow, they produce these annual growth rings, and here we see another group of trees slightly more dispersed, but only very, very slightly, or another group of trees here, again, much more widely dispersed. But even so, even though these trees are quite widely dispersed, these oak trees are all growing on the same sort of soil, they have the same sort of nutrients, the same water supply, the same sunlight, etc. So they all grow in pretty much the same way. And the annual growth rings, which you see here, the crucial point about them is that they vary in width from year to year, according mostly to the weather during the growing period. So the period usually from about March, and of course nowadays, maybe even sort of late February, but from March up to, well, nowadays, perhaps even late October, the trees are growing. And they're producing these annual growth rings, and the width of the rings varies according to the weather during the growing period. From October to March, i.e. in the winter period, the autumn and winter period, the trees are dormant and the sort of rings don't respond because no rings are being grown. And if I pass this particular piece of ground, again you can see the variations in the width. Careful that some of these are a little bit heavier. But you can see here how the rings are varying in width from year to year according to the weather. And all the trees growing in the same place at the same time are going to respond in pretty much the same sort of way, and thus the trees growing close together are going to have similar groups of rings.
Right.
Yes, please.
Why are there borders between the rings?
Now that's a good observation, because in the next slide you can see that each annual growth ring is made up of two parts. The lighter part are the cells that grow in the spring, and they start very, very quickly, very suddenly in the spring, and their size is large and they are very much less dense. But as the spring progresses into summer, the size of the cells decrease and the density increases and the wood becomes darker. Then at the end of the growing season, the growth stops, the cells stop being produced, and the tree lies dormant until suddenly the following spring, the spring cell growth starts again. So you can see how it's very easy, once the piece of wood is prepared by sanding and endless polishing and sort of bringing up to a very fine finish, it is easy to see the division between one year's growth and the next. So that you end up with these sort of bars, these lighter elements, which is the spring cell growth, and the darker summer cell growth. So that you can see quite clearly the difference between one year's growth and the next. And here again in this slide you can see the variation in width with the sort of more central rings of the tree up towards the top right-hand side, and the outer growth of the tree, the later, more recent growth of the tree, towards the lower left, etc. Year on year on year. And you can see there's a band of very wide rings, 2 or 3 very wide rings, followed by a band of 8 or 9, a dozen sort of narrow rings, wider year's growth, etc. And this is caused by the variation in weather year on year, with mostly sunshine and rainfall determining how wide the rings are. So within a good growing season, a good growing year, the rings are wide, with plenty of sunshine and just the right amount of rain and no attacks by aphids or insects, etc. The rings are wide. But in poorer years, when there's drought, or there's late frosts, or early frosts in the season, the growing season is shortened, the rings are narrow. So in effect, what we've got in tree rings, year on year, is a climate pattern determined by the weather during the growing season. And all oak trees growing in the same sort of patch of ground, in the same area, will be affected in the same way, and thus have similar patterns. But, and this is the crucial point, the pattern is only produced in the growing seasons that the trees are alive. So that because the weather over a consecutive number of years is unique, so too is the growth pattern of the tree. So that if you could plot the widths of the rings, having prepared the samples, as in one of the previous slides, in this slide here, having prepared the sample properly, it becomes possible to very accurately measure the width of each and every ring, starting at the innermost ring of the tree and measuring outwards. Ring by ring, measuring beneath a microscope to a tolerance of 1,000th of a millimetre, you get variations in the widths recorded, and I think I have a slide showing this, and you could, if you really wanted to, get a computer program that would draw a graph, and what we have here is the variations in width ring by ring, year by year, with the peaks representing widenings, good years of growth, and the troughs, baseline lines, showing the narrow ring when the trees are not growing quite so well. And it becomes possible, here we have two pieces of wood, two different oak samples from two different beams, and it becomes possible to measure the widths of the ring widths of both samples, and using our graph representation, show how the patterns of the two samples match each other. And this is because the two samples come from two different trees that were growing in the same place at the same time. They've got the same patterns because they grew at the same place and the same time, they were picked by the same weather. Now, if we could know the date of one of the samples, we might know the date of the other. Here's another example. You can see the actual core samples at the bottom there, and the graphs above. And it's possible, if we take a period of growth, in this example, two patterns, one between 1985 and 1909, matched at correct positions. You can see the graphs at the top level that match each other very well, whereas even if you offset them by 1 year, as in the bottom, the graph goes out slightly, out of sync by 1 year, showing the effect of a mismatch. In effect, what the rings are like is almost like a barcode that you see in a supermarket, product, a tin of beans or a tin of soup, etc. The ring widths are like a barcode. The variations in width year on year are like a barcode. And if you start with a known sample of a known date, it becomes possible to give a date, an actual calendrical date, to every ring in your sample. So here in this slide, my colleague Alison, who worked on this site with me, is stood by an oak tree that has been felled, and we know exactly when it was felled. It was felled in 2005, in fact, and we can give a ring date to every growth ring on that tree. So it becomes possible to take our supermarket barcode, as it were, and knowing the date of the outermost ring, i.e. knowing when the tree was felled, it becomes possible to give, in my imaginary example here, a calendrical date to all the other rings, ring by ring by ring. Any points or any observations, any queries at this stage? Yes, yes.
There was, in one of the samples you showed, there was the wide light ring for the spring, but there were some very wide dark rings for the summer. What would give rise to wide dark rings? On that one, on the left, that last slide that you just showed then,
This.
on the left, that one, on the left, there's a very wide
Yeah.
dark ring.
Well, we've got to remember that the two parts of the growth, the spring cell growth and the summer cell growth, are the 1 year. So it's the two together. The spring cell growth is not so much, determined by the weather. It's the summer cell growth that largely determines how wide the ring is going to be, how long the growing period is for that particular year, and how wide that ring is going to be. So you've got to take the sort of two parts together. The spring cell growth and the summer cell growth represents 1 year's worth of growth. And so, having ascribed a date to our fallen tree and our graph or our barcode in this imaginary example, it becomes possible to obtain the growth pattern of a sample from a building such as this, and we'll see how that's done shortly, and try and compare the growth pattern of our sample from a building such as this with, as it were, our reference pattern. reference pattern that we already know the date of. And in this graphic, what I'm trying to illustrate is how the patterns match each other. Now this pattern, these patterns, only occur at a particular time. Because the weather over a consecutive number of years is unique, so too is the growth pattern of the tree. If you take the weather pattern from 1600 to 1700, or from 1800 to 1850, or 1900 to 1990, any kind of consecutive period of growth, as long as it's a long enough period of growth, because the weather over that period of growth is unique year by year, so too is the growth pattern of the tree, so too are the rings. If you think about a period from 1650 to 1750, year by year, the weather pattern over that time, 100 years, is never going to be repeated exactly, probably ever again, in the last 5,000 years. Bits of it might be 10 years worth, or 20 years worth, or even 30, 40 years worth, could conceivably be reproduced. But once you start looking at 60, 70, 80, 100 years worth of growth, it is a unique pattern to a particular period of time. It's a sort of climate fingerprint. So we match our sample unknown date with patterns of known date. And we get patterns of known date by starting with trees that we know the date of. One of the reasons why the laboratory is based in Sherwood is because although it's not really in Sherwood Forest, it's close enough to Sherwood Forest for us to have obtained samples of known felling date from the Forestry Commission to begin building up our record on the present day, further back in time. Now, in this graphic, what I'm trying to illustrate is how, in the left-hand portion, the patterns of our barcode match each other, but in the right-hand side, over here, at an incorrect position, the patterns do not match. And this is what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to avoid mismatches and get only matches. Yes, please.
Does it change different the barcode, different parts of England, different parts of the range?
Yes, that's a very astute observation, because that does very much happen. And one of the things we're very interested in is, if you take a tree in this part of the world, or 10 trees from this part of the world, or 20 trees from this part of the world, how far away do you have to go before the climate in Worcestershire, or Gloucestershire, or Oxfordshire is different to what it is here? And how well do the patterns from this area match with patterns from other parts of the country? And the answer is that they don't terribly well, so we have to build up patterns, reference patterns, for all time periods from the present day back as far as we can, but we have to do it for every part of the country. And we're always trying to fill in the gaps to get local information, local data, local growth patterns from every part of the country to try, as it were, to sort of fill in the blanks in our database. So yes, it is important that there are these kind of regional variations, regional sort of microclimates that start to affect how well patterns match. So you have to have a very wide geographical sort of database. Yes?
Can you enlarge upon the building up of the reference chronology? I would surmise that you obviously have to, when you have a tree of known date felled recently, you then have to find another tree somewhat older with an overlapping lifespan, and then go back. Right, sorry.
Yes, yes. Well, no, you're one slide ahead of me. No, please. That is what exactly we have to do. When we begin with a known tree, obviously, if we go back to the slide of my colleague in front of the tree, this tree is it's 250 years old, and we know it was felled in 2005, but that will only take us back, in this part of this is in fact in Kent, in Maidstone in Kent, this will only take us back 250 years. And if we want to date older buildings, we somehow have to start building up patterns that overlap with present-day samples further and further back in time. And we begin this by sort of taking modern trees, i.e. trees that are living now, trees whenever they're felled, particularly oak trees whenever they're felled. We try and get samples to build up the modern kind of anchor base, but try and get back by using, for example, documentary sources, saying that, you know, such and such work was done at such and such a place at such and such a time, particularly in the sort of 19th, but even into the 18th century. So we are able to find buildings that have had no work done, sample them, and try and get those samples to match up with our modern trees, and gradually build up. And it takes a lot of time. It's, you know, it's like doing a jigsaw without having, you know, the picture to guide you as to what you're doing. So you're trying to put pieces together, and gradually, bit by bit, you build up a sequence, and then you start looking at sort of stylistic evidence. You think, well, this building is Elizabethan. It must date to around about 1650 or 1600. Let's see if we can get some samples from it, and see if we can get those samples to match in with our documentary source samples from documentary source buildings and so on, and then sort of build up and build up the book. And this is what we do all the time, until we work, you know, sufficiently dense a database in a particular area to sort of cover all the microclimates in a particular region and build up you know, a regional database. But every time you move or you work in a new area, you have to almost start all over again building up your database. And we've been doing this for 40 years or so, and there are still gaps in the reference patterns. There are still data to be had. You know, all data is good data as far as we're concerned. It adds to the sort of the database, the collection of data of all this type we have. But we have to kind of build this data up geographically and sort of time-wise, temporarily as well. Further and further back in time. And in some parts of the country, particularly, again, we're fortunate in sort of Nottinghamshire, the Nottingham lab, because we have the rivers Trent and the Derwent in the county, and because they're fairly local to us, we've been able to develop even a prehistoric database, because the river quarries, the gravel quarries, not even occasionally, but almost every week, pull out sort of prehistoric oak trees, bog oaks, from the gravel quarries, which we've had programs of sampling at, and we've been able to build up a database that runs back from the present day back to around about 4,000, 5,000 BC, but it's only in sort of Nottinghamshire and East Midlands, because of course, you know, it's the regional microclimate, and we can't use the prehistoric Trent Valley prehistoric chronology for prehistoric sites in Devon or Cornwall. So we're always on the lookout for more data. Now it's important, when we're sampling, when we're getting our actual samples, what we want to know, particularly what the likes of Duncan James want to know, is when was this building built? When was this timber felled? And the way we can be absolutely certain as to the precise year of felling is if the timber has bark. And in this slide here you can see the bark on the outside of the slice. You can see the growth rings of the tree. And if we can date the ring immediately beneath the bark, that's the tree felling date. That ring beneath the bark is the ring that grew the year the tree was felled. And if we can date that, we can say, well, this tree stopped growing in whatever that date is. So it's important to find timbers with bark on, and they're not too infrequent. You quite often, even after hundreds of years, come across timbers that have got bark on, and this slide here, this is a barn in a sheep shed in Derbyshire after all this time, or you find samples with or timbers that have got sort of worm galleries on, indicating that this is worm just beneath the bark, and the outermost ring of the tree is still on the sample if you can get it. But even where you can't get the bark, it becomes possible to work out the likely felling date, because the number of sapwood rings, and that's the lighter outer portion of the tree, is a constant figure. As one new ring is laid down on the tree just beneath the bark, it's laid down as a sapwood ring, but as that happens, the innermost sapwood ring, as it were, dies and becomes part of the heartwood. And there is this constant progression of the sapwood rings to the outside of the tree, but it's a fairly constant number. So that you can, if you have the heartwood sapwood boundary or just some sapwood rings, you can work out how many likely rings are missing and thus still get a likely felling rate. So, plenty of examples here. Another good example of the variations in width, the annual growth rings of the tree, how they vary in width from year to year, showing the spring cell growth, the lighter colour, and the summer cell growth, and also the lighter colour of the sapwood to the outside. Any further points or any quick? Because I'm just thinking. So,
this is actually fascinating. How do you deal with variation if you follow a circumference of a growth
yes.
ring? Sometimes you get a really large section and then a tiny section within that same growth.
Now, are you talking about the rings themselves, or are you talking about the sapwood? Because sometimes the sapwood varies, the number of sapwood.
So if I was trying to count rings,
Yep.
and it got unclear, so I followed the ring
Yeah.
round. But then suddenly I thought, I see there's a huge gap between the two rings, whereas over here it's so small.
Yes, trees, I'm not quite sure if I have an example. I'm not sure if the slice that was going round shows this, but trees, when they grow, such as in this woodland here, they rarely grow so that the centre of the tree, the first ring of the tree, is in the centre of the tree. The trees tend to grow rather erratically, so that one side of the tree, the rings seem to be quite wide, but the other side of the tree, the rings are rather narrow, because the slope of the ground or the position of the tree is in relation to the sunlight, etc. So that it often looks as if the rings to one side of the tree are all much narrower than they are to the other side of the tree, which they are, but we use a method of taking the ratios of the growth, or the proportion of the growth of the rings, so that in ratio terms the patterns are the same, so that although certain rings out this side are much narrower than they are out this side, but all wider, in proportional terms to each other they are all the same, so the patterns are the same. And very often, if we can, it doesn't very often happen, if we get a circular slice, we will measure out one side and then measure out the other to sort of counterbalance any possible variations in the growth, if there are any distortions. And sometimes, particularly when we're kind of developing chronologies, we will take some 4 readings from the same slice, and so on. Because, I don't know if perhaps if you have a look at one of those slices in a moment, samples. I pass some of these this way. These are core samples from the timbers here, and pass those to you, pass them on round. Try not to stack them, they're fairly robust, and we core them with hollow cylindrical cores. Will I trust you to poke your own eyes out with those? These hollow cylindrical cores which fit into an ordinary power drill. 110-volt Black & Decker Bosch power drill, and we core those samples out of them. And here we see the roof, we were able to get a scaffold tower in and sort of get it up so that we could reach the upper timbers. We cored, various places. I won't point out. I can see where the timbers were cored. You do plug them and stain them, etc. So they're not, too visible. But knowing where I worked, I can now spot them, etc. But we sampled a selection of timbers here in the lower portion, and then I don't know. A year later or 18 months later, we came back when the roof was off. Work was being done on the roof because we wanted to try and see whether the timbers down. There was a theory that these lower parts of the church, these lower timbers, these main trusses of the roof, were possibly of a different date to the material up above. So we came back and we sampled more of the roof. It's kind of concealed from down here. You can't see it from down here. This is sort of 20th century boarding. But above, there are these elements, these trusses, these main timbers, just about here, sort of collar pieces and principal rafters, which we were able to get to when the roof was off. Luckily, and we core them with the corers. This is the kind of coring device. The corer fits into a kind of a chuck piece which fits into an ordinary drill, and there's sort of various lengths of corer. I've shown you the sort of long stuff, and we pull out cores like this, which we then sand by polishing. So it's on a belt sander, and then with varying grades of glass paper, etc. Polishing and polishing and polishing, until eventually the rings show up very clearly, and we sample different selection of beams and different selection of timbers. It depends on the size of the building and the number of timbers in the building and which particular timbers somebody is particularly interested in. So we sample and sample and sample. Our hearts can. Because don't forget, we're trying to get the data from these timbers to make sure we get a good, positive result. And we're trying to add this data to our database back at the laboratory. So we're rather greedy, and we take as many samples as we can. And then this is a picture of yours truly sat in front of the measuring station. Here I am, sort of looking down a microscope at a set of crosshairs in the microscope, and the sample, you can just about make it out on the sort of plate there at the bottom, is seen through my viewfinder of the microscope, and I turn the small handle to the left, millimetre by millimetre, and the sample passes across my vision, millimetre by millimetre, through the crosshairs, and I click a mouse, and the distance that this stage has moved is measured in thousandths of a millimetre. And in this particular chart, I'm not sure if this shows terribly well. This is a list of the samples that we took here. So the south post of Truss 1, this one here, the lower brace of Truss 2, north, etc. This lists all the samples, and each sample we take gets a unique code and number. So in this case, this is Brampton Bryan, so we've given it the code BRM, C for church, Brampton Bryan, church, and we list all the samples, and we, having measured the samples, we get a record of the number of rings and how many of those rings are sapwood, etc. And then, having dated it, we are able to give the date in our report. And what we're trying to do is match all these samples from this side together. And in a way, what I'm trying to illustrate here is how the samples overlap with each other and match each other, because they've all grown at the same place at the same time, and their patterns match each other. So this is a way of trying to illustrate how well they match and how their relative positions date. And then by looking at the amount of sapwood on the various samples, I am able to calculate the likely felling rate of the timbers, looking at whether some of the samples have complete sapwood and have bark, etc., whether they don't, whether they're missing some sapwood rings, and so on, and try and work out when the timbers were felled. And it turns out, in this case, that the majority of timbers here were felled at some point within the range, excuse me, between some point between 1638 and 1650. Two of the timbers have complete sapwood on, and both timbers have last green dates of 1644. Now, knowing the way that medieval carpenters and medieval builders work, it's very likely that all the timber for a structure like this was felled as part of a single programme of felling. Go out to the nearest woodland, or the most likely supply of timber, and cut all the trees that were required for the building, all at pretty much the same time. Maybe not all in the same weekend or in the same month, but probably within a year or so. They'd be felled, shaped up roughly, trimmed, carted away, brought to the works yard or brought to site. A month later, another half dozen trees would be felled, brought to site, and so on. So the felling might take place over a period of time, and it might take place over a short period of years. But it would seem that timbers usually are felled within a fairly tight period of time, not over many, unless it's a huge undertaking. Notre Dame or York Minster or Lincoln Cathedral, then it might take decades and sometimes centuries for the building that you see now to have had its timber felled, etc. So it seems all the timbers were felled in the sort of middle part, of the earlier to middle part of the 17th century, between about 1638 and 1650. And this date, turns out, sort of supports a postulated date for the rebuilding of this roof, etc., in the 1650s, which I think is a little bit later than might have been expected initially from some historical records, etc., and so on. But now this is something that is quite important, and that often we're slightly wary of. What we're doing as dendrochronologists is finding out when the trees were felled. It's another question for the sort of architectural historian and the buildings archaeologist to say this building was built within 5 years of that date, or was built within 10 years of that date, or that date is totally wrong, Robert, you miscalculated, go back and look again, but I'm afraid that we can't. Now, there are a couple of interesting things that we've discovered about the timbers here that I'd like to highlight. When we get our data from a building like this, we compare it with reference patterns, as suggested here, with reference patterns from every part of the country. The press of a button, the data, the combined data from this site, is compared with hundreds, thousands of reference patterns for every part of the country for all time periods. Obviously, we don't know what the data of the building is until we sort of run it against reference chronologies. So we run it against everything from sort of prehistoric stuff right up to modern stuff, just to make sure. But although the data from here has been compared to sites everywhere in Britain, the thing that stands out is how well the material from here matches with other sites in the general region, with Wigmore Hall in Herefordshire, Hertfordbury Castle at Stourport on Severn, and other sites in Shropshire, Herefordshire, Worcestershire, Shropshire, Devon, and why Kingston upon Thames, London, I don't know. But what it shows is that the material from here matches best with timbers from other sites in this general area, suggesting that the timbers here were grown in this area. Now, that in many ways stands to reason. You don't want to have, fell timbers 100 miles away and have to cart them here along the sort of non-existent roads of the country in the 17th or indeed into the 18th century. But it's nice to be able to demonstrate, to show that the material used here is of local origin. Sometimes it's possible to show that timber has come considerable distances, and sometimes it's possible to show that timber has come from abroad. We have a selection of reference patterns from buildings in Europe, from the Baltic states, from northern Poland, from sort of Denmark and Eastern Europe, and it's possible to show that certain timbers have been imported from that part of the world. The second thing that was slightly unusual about the samples from here is that the timbers, although the beams themselves are not fantastically large, although they're quite large, they're not fantastically large, and particularly as you get up to the upper timbers and into the roof. It seems that the trees that these beams have been taken from, were growing for some time in the region of 350 to 400 years before they were felled. Now that is slightly unusual in Denver terms. It's not unusual to find trees that are 100 years old or 150 years old, and sometimes 200 years old. But to find trees that are growing to such an age in any part of the country is slightly unusual. But it seems that the trees used here, when they were felled in the 1650s, had been growing for many years. And I think if I go back to this table here, which shows the date, the first ring date on the sample, some of those samples that I've passed around, the trees started growing in the sort of early 13th century. Some of them date back, the first ring dates, that date back to 1233 and 1299, etc. So some of them were quite old when they began growing. So the 2 points is that the timbers used here are of fairly local origin, certainly within sort of this region, within sort of the Welsh marches, I'd say, Herefordshire, Worcestershire. It'd be interesting to know how far they would have come, and also the fact that they're all of us about the same sort of date, all being felled in the sort of 1650s. Where's my series of notes? I'm going the wrong way. Yes, so that it turns out that in fact these lower timbers and the upper timbers are pretty much of the same date, and that it's all of one mid-17th century date, and probably dating to, dare I suggest, just after the Civil War, etc. Which I don't think we knew beforehand. Yes, the question here.
Would these trees have been felled specifically for this task?
Yes, I think they would. I think they would, because the fact that the patterns of these trees all match each other. They match each other very well. They were all growing in the same patch of woodland. So, and because they're all felled at the same time, it's highly likely that they were all felled specifically for this structure. It would be of interest to know, were there any, how do they decide beforehand? We need 50 timbers, we need 50 trees, or do they say, well, let's fell 50 trees, and if there's any left over, we'll sell them, or we'll use them at another building next time there's a bit of building work, we'll have a couple of spares already felled. That's a possibility, and in some situations that does seem to have happened. But I think here, and indeed in most buildings, the timbers were felled specifically for the structure within which they were within which they were. Right, well I think I will conclude there my talk, but I'm happy to take further questions. Yes, please.
The referencing is interesting. And I just want to know, where do you get your trees from? Do you get tip-offs or specifically
Well,
target certain trees?
yes,
Could you repeat the question?
yes, an interesting question. We're talking about how we when we look at modern trees, how do we find modern trees? Where do we does somebody, say, here, we're felling some trees in the woodlands if you want to come along. That used to happen when the Forestry Commission were a proper sort of commission, not an agency. We had contacts sort of with them, and they would say, oh, we're felling 20, 50 trees in Sherwood Forest, or we're felling 100 trees in the Wyre Forest, or in the Forest of Dean, etc. Do you want to come along with a chainsaw and take the slices out? That tends not to happen now. And we have to, as it were, specifically say, hunt out some likely contacts and say, we're interested in trees in Worcestershire, we're interested in trees in Dorset. Do you have any local contacts? And people sort of come back and say, yeah, we'll let you know when we are there. But it has become quite difficult. What in fact we do sometimes do is we can actually core living trees and take samples from them. We have a series of very small micro cores that we can bore into trees and extract the core from the tree and then get our data. It doesn't harm the trees, and the cores are very small. But yes, the supply of modern trees is not as free-flowing as it used to be.
Could I ask a question?
Yes, please.
If we try and count rings of a tree that's been felled and chopped up,
Yeah.
sounds a silly question. Does it have the same number of rings at the bottom of the tree as it does 20 feet up?
No.
Where should you be counting the rings?
Well, if you want to count the rings to find out how old the tree is, it is better to count nearer the bottom.
Yes.
But it seems that the difference between the bottom of the tree and sort of further up the trunk is not very great.
Yeah.
Probably only 10 or maybe 15 years of difference. The tree will reach almost its full height within sort of 15 or 20 years and then start to spread, etc., and have the same number of rings all through it, etc. But yes, that sometimes baffled us as well, because sometimes you would find that the trees were the same tree, but the rings number was slightly different, and because the centre rings at one side are missing of the tree. So, was there a question?
Well, just about your data you collect and all this wonderful matching with your sort of blind jigsaw. Is there a sort of national international database of all the research that's been done you can match to, or do you?
No, there isn't we cooperate. So if we have data, what mostly happens, in fact, is that when we have data such as data from here, we actually send it off blind to somebody else to say, what do you make of it? Can you just run it and see what you get, etc. And they come back and say, oh, we get this, and we compare notes, etc. So there is a sort of an ad hoc database, but not, we don't spend all our data, it's probably 90%, but there's still 10% that we don't send off properly. But there is no dedicated database of even nationally. What tends to happen is that if we have data that we want somebody else to look at, we will send it to them, and they have our data. But there's not generally one that anyone can consult just to at a whim, etc.
So do you tend to become sort of specialist in an area?
Yeah, sort of, yes. We do a little bit, but it's not quite as severe as it used to be when we first began, because of the problems of having sort of local anchored, modern tree databases, so that you could work from, if you like, the springboard. So we used to have a specialism in the East Midlands, where we first began, which is quite a large area of England. We developed a specialism in Kent because of a particular project that we were doing, and then we developed a specialism in sort of northeast and northwest England. Now that's pretty much most of England. We also collaborated with other members to work on a particular problem in Devon and Cornwall. Because of the climate, as you move further and further west, the climate becomes nicer. I notice that the blossom down here is a week ahead of what it is in Nottingham, because the weather is so nice down here. Trees tend to grow to a usable size very quickly, and because they grow to a usable size, they have low numbers of rings in, and it becomes difficult to match samples with low numbers of rings. But one way around is by sampling massively in a particular area. So we have developed a specialism in sort of Devon and Cornwall, but it's not, it's not exclusive. We think we sometimes sort of tender for a piece of work in Devon, thinking, well, that's our specialist area, and somebody else gets the job, and you think, well, they're going to send us their data because they can, which they do. Sorry, was there a question up here?
Yeah. Are you developing technology to put you out of a job in terms of your job peering down a microscope and counting rings and measuring widths?
We've tried, and it's okay where the rings are nice and clear and far apart. But if you look at some of the samples that I passed around this evening from here, they wouldn't work with us because there's not enough division between one ring and the next. But I dare say, as time goes on, that problem will be overcome. But by that time I should be retired. Sorry, there's a question up here.
To your knowledge, is anybody using your database to look at climate change?
Not particularly. We used to routinely send our data to the University of East Anglia, sort of climate research unit, up to probably the late 1980s and early 1990s, but then they stopped asking for it. I don't know why. In part I think it's because with the tree rings, you're really only getting a snapshot of a certain part of the year, of the summer, the spring and summer. You're not really getting a picture of what the climate is like, the rest of the year, etc. But they certainly used to, but I don't think anybody is just now, which is a shame. It's a vast. I mean, here, I forget how many samples we did. We take 40 samples from here. We take 30, 40 samples from almost every building we go to. And we've been at it for 40 years, and we're at a building once a week. So that's a lot of cores. That's a lot of data that I'm sure would be of interest other than sort of just dating. So, yes, yeah.
I believe that there used to be a tradition around Brampton Bryan that some of the timbers in the roof of the current church were reused from the castle after the castle was destroyed in the siege. Presumably these findings, am I right in thinking that these findings put that to bed?
I think they do. There's little evidence, so I don't think I saw any evidence of any timber being reused anywhere in this building. There's no empty mortises, no sort of redundant tenons, nothing that sort of looks like a reused timber. So yeah, I think that it's so sad to say, a myth or a legend is finished.
And the other, sorry,
no, go on, Deborah, go on.
The other thing that, saying that a lot of very old trees seem to have been felled in a very short time.
Yeah.
When you consider the level of destruction there was in the village after the siege, it would be fascinating to know whether some of the timbers that were used here are actually to be found also in some of the other buildings in the village.
Well, it would be of interest. In theory, it wouldn't even take any sampling. It would take a visual inspection to say these are long-lived trees or These are
Because it must have been a massive rebuilding program.
Yes, it would be of interest. Sorry, Duncan.
I just wanted to say that on the matter of the timbers here, they've been sawn in the saw pit. And we know that timbers in Herefordshire, if they're sawn in the saw pit, they post-date 1540. So any early timbers would be trestle sawn, they have diagonal sawn. And that's a very well established, because of tree dating, we've been able to establish that with great clarity in Herefordshire. So there was never any question in my mind that the timbers here, apart from anything else, the design of this is so different to the design of a roof that would be over a grand hall. And as Robert says, there are no redundant vortices and such like. So it would also be smoke blackened. We'd have smoke blackening.
Yeah.
And the whole thing of reusing early timbers is very difficult because the oak is rock hard. So if you're cutting new mortises and things, you're going to have a lot of work. So there's a few points. There's just one other thing, Robert. I was most interested in the longevity of the timbers. Presumably close rings. You had.
Yes, if you look at the samples, you'll see it's to the naked eye. It's almost impossible to see 1 year's growth from the next. They're absolutely packed.
You see, I just wonder if the timbers that we used here, the trees that we used here, came from an ecclesiastical holding of woodland, where there'd been long-term management. And then I look around, and of course we have Wigmore close by, and whether it was possibly Wigmore Abbey that was holding.
If you look at this table here,
yes, I saw
this shows the top. 15.8.
Yeah.
This is kind of a statistical measure of how similar the patterns are. And sort of this measure would suggest that these trees were growing next to the trees that were used at Wigmore Hall. Now, of course, we don't know where the timbers used at Wigmore Hall actually came from. We only know where they ended up, at Wigmore Hall. But again, one assumes that they haven't come very far. And if we had an inkling as to where the timbers came from, it would be a particular interest.
I'm just wondering that following the dissolution, whether there were holdings of woodland which came into the ownership of the Harlow estate. So it's
I
an interesting
suppose
one.
that you could do a documentary search to find examples where the accounts for building large buildings showed where timber comes from.
Yes.
For example, I remember many years ago I was at Harlech Castle in Wales.
Oh yeah.
And they have because it was a government thing.
Yeah.
They have the accounts and the details of the building of it, and it appears that I think the oak timbers for Harlech Castle came from a small oak wood a few miles to the south. Yeah. Which was, I think, only
interesting.
4 or 5 miles.
Yeah.
And that sort of gives you
an idea.
Calibration or an idea of how far.
Yes. One of the things when we were talking about the building up of the reference database, and I was talking about sort of documentary sources for timbers. One of the great sources for timbers in our early days of work was Lincoln Cathedral, because they had very precise documentary references as to not only where the timber had come from, i.e. mostly Sherwood Forest, but where in the cathedral. Something else that sort of covers this is that the quantity of data that we've got from here is very, very high. 40 samples is a lot of samples. So the data, the climatic data, is very, very representative of sort of the western part of England, etc. And the material from Sydenham House is also, it's 100 or 150 samples. So it too is very representative. So it could be the fact that we've got such good representation, such replication of the data that they match very well. But it makes you wonder.
Kingston on Thames is not really quite the same.
Kingston on Thames, and I don't know is the honest answer, but it makes you, scratch your head and